The year is 2026. The United States of America owes $38.4 trillion, not billion trillion. With the T in the meter is still running, $8 billion a day, 334 million an hour, 5.5 million every single minute you sit there watching this video. In the time it takes you to make a cup of coffee, the national debt grows by another $27 million. By the time you finish watching this, it will have grown by 300 million. But let's get one thing straight before the pundits spin this into another partisan shouting match. This isn't about left versus right. This isn't about Democrats or Republicans. Both parties held the credit card. Both parties maxed it out. What you are watching isn't a political debate. It is arithmetic, and the arithmetic just stopped working. How does the richest country in human history spend more on interest payments than it spends defending itself? How does the nation that prints the world's reserve currency get downgraded by every single credit agency on Earth? How do you owe more than your entire economy produces in a year and still pass a law that adds another 3.4 trillion to the tab? Today, we're not debating politics, we're opening the books. This is the forensic audit of the largest debt in the history of civilization. This is the $38 trillion bomb, and the fuse is already lit. The $36 trillion bomb, or why America's debt just became uninvestable. To understand why this bomb is ticking, you need to understand one number that tells you everything about where the United States stands in February 2026. $970 billion. That is how much the federal government paid in interest on its debt in fiscal year 2025 alone. Not on roads, not on schools, not on tanks or aircraft carriers or veterans' hospitals. Just interest. Just the fee for borrowing money that was already spent. Here is the first nail in the coffin. The interest bomb in fiscal year 2025. The United States spent $970 billion on interest payments. For context, it spent $917 billion on the entire Department of Defense. Read that again. America now pays more to service its debt than it pays to defend itself. More than Medicare, more than Medicaid, more than veterans' benefits, education, and transportation combined. Interest on the debt is now the third largest line item in the federal budget, behind only Social Security and Medicare. And the Congressional Budget Office projects it will hit $1 trillion in fiscal year 2026. $1 trillion just in interest. That is $2.6 billion a day, every single day. Let me put that in perspective for you. Imagine you have a credit card. Every month you make the minimum payment, but the minimum payment is so large that you can't afford groceries. So you open another credit card to buy groceries, and then you use the first card to make the payment on the second card. That is not a household budget. That is a death spiral. And that is exactly what the United States government is doing right now. But here is what really bakes your noodle. The interest rate on all that debt is still relatively low by historical standards. The average rate on marketable Treasury securities as of December 2025 was just 3.36%. 5 years ago, it was 1.55%. So even though rates have more than doubled, we still haven't fully felt the impact. Why? Because the government is constantly rolling over old cheap debt into new, more expensive debt. It is like having a mortgage that resets higher every time a chunk of it comes due. And trillions of dollars in low-rate pandemic-era bonds are maturing over the next few years. When they roll over at today's rates, the interest bill is going to explode even further. The Congressional Budget Office's own projections assume rates stay manageable. If rates rise even slightly above projections, the numbers go from terrifying to unthinkable. The CBO projects that over the next decade, the federal government will spend $13.8 trillion just on interest. $13.8 trillion, that is $4.3 trillion more than the entire projected defense budget for the same period. You want to know what you could build with $13.8 trillion? You could rebuild every road, bridge, school, and hospital in America twice. Instead, it is going to bondholders. It is going to foreign governments. It is going to pay the bill for money that was already spent on things that are already broken. And here is the dark irony. The interest payments themselves are now generating more debt, which generates more interest, which generates more debt. It is a compound fracture of the national balance sheet. The debt is feeding on itself. This is nail number 2. The snowball that ate the treasury, or how a manageable debt became an existential one. Let me take you back for a moment because the speed of this unraveling is genuinely hard to comprehend. In 1980, the total national debt was $907 billion. Sounds like a lot. It was about 32% of GDP. Manageable. Boring, even. By 1990, it hit 3.2 trillion. By 2000, 5.6 trillion. And then the rocket engines ignited. 2001. The war on terror begins. Tax cuts. Two wars on the national credit card. 2008. The financial crisis hits. Bank bailouts. Stimulus packages. 2017. Another round of tax cuts projected to cost 1.9 trillion over a decade. 2020. COVID arrives. Emergency spending on a scale not seen since the Second World War. Each crisis became a blank check. Each blank check became a new baseline. Nobody ever unwound the emergency spending. They just stacked the next emergency on top. Here is the pattern that should terrify you. In good times, politicians cut taxes. In bad times, politicians increase spending. In no times do politicians do the opposite. The ratchet only turns one way: spend more, borrow more, promise more, and leave the bill for the next generation. Every single time. In 2008, when the financial crisis hit, the national debt stood at roughly $10 trillion. 17 years later, it is $38.4 trillion. It nearly quadrupled. The U.S. economy grew by about 60% in the same period. The debt grew by nearly 300%. That math doesn't just not work. It is a mathematical certainty of disaster. As of the end of fiscal year 2025, federal debt held by the public hit 100% of GDP, 100%. The last time America was in that territory was 1946, right after spending 4 years fighting a world war on two fronts against fascism. There is no world war today. There was no existential threat that required borrowing more than the entire economy produces. This debt was accumulated during peacetime, during growth, during what was supposed to be prosperity, and the CBO's projections are genuinely terrifying. By 2035, debt to GDP is projected to reach 118%. By 2055, 156%. These aren't doomsday scenarios from a conspiracy blog. This is the Congressional Budget Office. This is the government's own calculator telling Congress that the math is broken. But surely the credit markets have noticed, right? Surely the people lending America money have raised an eyebrow? Oh, they've done more than raise an eyebrow. They've raised the alarm. They've raised it 3 times. And nobody listened. This is nail number 3. The triple downgrade. The death of the AAA. For most of American history, the U.S. government had the gold standard of credit ratings. AAA from every major agency. It meant one simple thing. Lending money to America is the safest bet on earth. You will get your money back. Period. In 2011, Standard & Poor's looked at the debt ceiling circus, looked at the political dysfunction, and did something no one thought possible. They downgraded the United States of America from AAA to AA+. Washington was furious. The Treasury called it arbitrary. Wall Street shrugged. It was just S&P being dramatic, they said. The other agencies still had us at AAA. Everything was fine. Then in August 2023, Fitch looked at the same dysfunction, the same brinkmanship, the same refusal to address the structural deficit, and they pulled the trigger too. AA+. Fitch cited an erosion of governance that had led to repeated standoffs over the federal debt limit. An erosion of governance, that is the polite way of saying the adults have left the building, and they've taken the checkbook with them. But there was still Moody's, the last holdout. The last agency in the world still giving America its top rating. Surely Moody's would hold the line. On May 16, 2025, while Congress was debating the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, Moody's dropped the hammer. Downgraded AA1 for the first time in over a century. The United States of America does not hold a top-tier credit rating from a single major agency on planet Earth. Think about that sentence. Let it sink in. The country that invented modern capital markets, the country whose treasury bond was considered the risk-free rate, the baseline against which every other investment on earth is measured. That country just got told by every major credit agency that its debt is no longer the safest bet in the world. And if that wasn't enough, in October 2025, the European Credit Agency Scope went even further and downgraded the US to double a minus, citing sustained deterioration in public finances and a weakening of governance. Think about that. European credit analysts are now looking at the United States the way the US used to look at developing nations. After the Moody's downgrade, the 30-year Treasury yield spiked above 5%, 5% on a 30-year bond. That is the market's way of saying, we're going to need a little more compensation for the privilege of lending you money, because we're not entirely sure you are good for it anymore. This is nail number 4, the foreign exit. When your biggest creditors start heading for the door, the United States doesn't just borrow from itself, it borrows from the world. Foreign investors hold roughly $9.2 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities. That is about 30% of all publicly held debt. And for decades, this arrangement worked beautifully. America needed money. The world needed a safe place to park their cash. Treasury bonds were the global savings account. But the guest list at this party is changing. Japan is still the largest foreign holder at $1.18 trillion. The United Kingdom is second at roughly $865 billion. But look at the name that used to be number 1, China. In 2013, China held $1.3 trillion in U.S. treasuries. By March 2025, that number had dropped to $757 billion, a decline of over 40%. China isn't just trimming its position, it is executing a multi-year strategic withdrawal from American debt, and it is not hard to understand why. When you are engaged in a trade war with someone, lending them money starts to feel a little counterproductive. Trade tensions, sanctions risk, tariff escalations, these are not the conditions under which you double down on your biggest geopolitical rivals, iOS. But China isn't the only one diversifying. In October 2025, Treasury data showed a net outflow of $37.3 billion in total foreign capital. Foreign official institutions, meaning governments and central banks, were net sellers of $10.1 billion in long-term U.S. securities that month alone. The era of automatic, unquestioning foreign demand for American debt is ending. Not with a bang, with a slow, steady reallocation of the world's savings away from the country that used to be the only game in town. And what is China buying instead? Gold, over 2,298 tons of it. Russia, 2,336 tons combined. BRICS nations now hold over 6,000 tons of gold, roughly 20% of all global central bank gold reserves. Central banks worldwide purchased over 1,000 tons of gold annually for 3 consecutive years from 2022 to 2024. The longest such streak in modern history. This isn't a coincidence, it is a coordinated hedge. When the world's central banks are hoarding gold at a pace not seen in decades, they're telling you something. They're telling you they don't fully trust the piece of paper they used to treat as sacred. The US dollar still represents about 57% of global foreign exchange reserves. But that number has been falling. It was 72% in 2000. The decline is slow, but it is relentless. And every percentage point matters when you are borrowing $2 trillion a year. This is nail number 5. The de-dollarization drift. It is not a cliff. It is a slow leak in a boat that can't afford to take on any water. The BRICS bloc, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and their expanding roster of partners, has been building alternative financial plumbing. BRICS Pay, a decentralized payment system designed to bypass SWIFT. Bilateral trade agreements settled in local currencies, not dollars. A precious metals exchange where physical gold can be traded without touching a single greenback. In 2023, a fifth of all oil trades were conducted in non-dollar currencies. That might sound small, but oil was once the dollar's cathedral. The petrodollar system, where oil was priced exclusively in US dollars, was the foundation of American financial hegemony. Every barrel of oil sold anywhere on Earth required someone to hold dollars. That created permanent structural demand for the currency, and that demand is eroding. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves was 72% in 2000. By 2024, it had fallen to 59%, a 13 percentage point decline in 24 years. That might sound gradual, but when the global reserve pool is measured in trillions, every single percentage point represents hundreds of billions of dollars in demand that no longer exists. Demand that used to keep borrowing costs low. Demand that used to give America the exorbitant privilege of borrowing in its own currency at cheap rates while the rest of the world paid through the nose. Now, let me be clear. The dollar isn't dying tomorrow. It is still the most liquid, most traded, most trusted currency in the world. But trust is a funny thing. It doesn't evaporate all at once. It leaks out. Slowly, until one day you realize the bathtub is empty, which brings us to nail number 6. The Big Beautiful Lie, or how to add $3.4 trillion to a house fire and call it a renovation. On the 4th of July 2025, Independence Day no less, President Trump signed into law the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. The name alone should tell you something. When politicians name a law like a cologne, they're trying to distract you from the ingredients. The Congressional Budget Office, the nonpartisan scorekeeper, estimated that the bill would increase deficits by $3.4 trillion over the next decade. $3.4 trillion. It includes $4.5 trillion in tax cuts, partially offset by $1.4 trillion in spending reductions, mostly from Medicaid, food stamps, and student loans. Let me translate that. They cut health care for the poor and nutritional assistance for hungry families, and they still managed to add $3.4 trillion to the debt. The Penn-Wharton budget model estimated $2.8 trillion. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget estimated over $3 trillion with interest costs included. Nobody, not a single credible independent analyst, looked at this bill and said it reduces the deficit. Not one. And what did Treasury Secretary Bessent call the Moody's downgrade that happened while the bill was being debated? A lagging indicator. A lagging indicator. When the fire alarm goes off, you don't call it a lagging indicator and keep grilling steaks in the living room. And here is the part that makes an economist weep into their spreadsheet. The CBO estimated that the bill would push debt held by the public to 124% of GDP by 2034. Under the rosiest scenario, if the temporary provisions are made permanent, which everyone knows they will be because they always are, debt could reach 134% of GDP. That is not a budget. That is a confession. Moody's downgraded America while Congress was literally debating this bill. The market was screaming. The credit agencies were screaming. And Congress passed it anyway on Independence Day. You can't make this up. It is as if someone set off fireworks inside a powder magazine and called it a celebration. But if the debt bomb is ticking, the Social Security clock is ticking louder. Because there is a date on the calendar that should keep every American over 50 awake at night, and that date is getting closer. This is nail number 7. The 2033 cliff. Social Security's Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund, the fund that pays retirement benefits to over 69 million Americans, is projected to be depleted in 2033. Not 2050, not someday 2033. 7 years from now, when today's 59-year-olds reach their full retirement age, when the trust fund runs dry, the program can only pay out what it takes in through payroll taxes. That means an automatic 23% cut in benefits across the board. 23%. For the average retiree receiving $1,800 a month, that is a loss of over $400 every month, indefinitely. And it is not like this sneaked up on anyone. The Social Security trustees have been publishing these projections for years. Congress has known about this funding gap since the 1990s. In 1960, there were more than 5 workers paying into the system for every single beneficiary today. That ratio has dropped to less than 3 to 1, fewer workers supporting more retirees. The math was always going to fail. The only question was when, and the answer is now staring us in the face. 7 years. Now imagine this happening to 70 million people simultaneously. The elderly poverty rate would roughly double according to the American Enterprise Institute. And here is the debt connection. Social Security's trust funds hold roughly $2.7 trillion in special Treasury securities. As the trust fund draws down, those securities get redeemed, which means the Treasury has to borrow from the public market to replace them. The impending Social Security crisis isn't separate from the debt crisis. It is an accelerant. It is a second bomb strapped to the first bomb. And Medicare's Hospital Insurance Trust Fund, also projected to be depleted by 2033, the same year, two of America's largest programs hitting the wall simultaneously. Total Social Security cash deficits over the next decade are projected at $3.6 trillion. The program is $25 trillion short over the next 75 years. Congress has known about this for decades. They've done nothing, because fixing it requires raising taxes or cutting benefits, and both of those things lose elections. So they kick the can, and the can has gotten so large that it is now a dumpster. And the dumpster is on fire, and the fire department is also broke. This is nail number 8. The debt spiral, or the mathematical trap that no politician will explain to you because it would end their career. Here is the thing about debt that makes it different from other problems. A pothole gets worse slowly, a leaky roof degrades over years. But debt compounds. Every dollar of unpaid interest becomes new principal. New principal generates new interest. And if you are running deficits every year, you are adding fuel to a fire that is already self-sustaining. Let me walk you through the doom loop. Step 1. The government runs a deficit, currently about $1.9 trillion a year. Step 2. To cover the deficit, the Treasury issues bonds. Step 3. The bonds carry interest, currently averaging about 3.4% on marketable debt. Step 4. The interest payments add to next year's spending. Step 5. That increased spending creates a larger deficit. Step 6. Go back to step 1. In fiscal year 2020, the government paid $345 billion in interest. In 2023, $659 billion. In 2024, $881 billion. In 2025, $970 billion. In 2026, the CBO projects it will cross $1 trillion. By 2035, $1.8 trillion. By 2055, $4.8 trillion. The interest line is growing faster than any other category in the federal budget, faster than Social Security, faster than Medicare, faster than defense. It is the blob that eats the budget. Think about what that means in practical terms. Over the next decade, the government will spend $13.8 trillion on interest. That is $4.3 trillion more than the total projected defense budget. Imagine telling a general that you can't fund his aircraft carrier because you are too busy paying Visa. Imagine telling a teacher that her school can't get new textbooks because the interest bill already ate the education budget. That is not a hypothetical. That is already happening, and here is what makes it a true trap. To slow the debt growth, you need to cut spending or raise taxes. But cutting spending means slashing programs that millions of people depend on. Raising taxes slows the economy, which reduces revenue, which increases the deficit. And in the current political climate, neither party will do either. So the spiral continues uninterrupted, accelerating. This is nail number 9, the Sell America trade. When the bond market finally starts to growl. In April 2025, something happened that rattled the financial world. After the administration announced its Liberation Day tariff package, the usual playbook broke. Normally, when stocks fall, investors flee to the safety of Treasury bonds. That is the whole point of Treasuries. They're the safe haven, the rock. But in April 2025, stocks fell and Treasuries fell. The dollar fell, everything American fell simultaneously. They called it the Sell America trade. Investors weren't rotating from stocks to bonds, they were rotating out of America entirely. Gold surged, the Swiss franc surged, the euro surged. And the 30-year Treasury yield, the number that tells you what the market really thinks about America's long-term financial health, it climbed above 5%. The phrase Sell America was supposed to be unthinkable. This is the country that has been the safe haven of last resort since 1945. When the world panics, money flows to America. That has been the iron law of global finance for 80 years. And in April 2025, that law was broken, not permanently, not fatally, but the crack appeared. And in the bond market, cracks don't heal. They get watched, they get priced, and if they widen, they get punished. 5% on a 30-year bond doesn't sound scary until you do the math. When yields go up, the price of existing bonds goes down. And when you have $38 trillion in outstanding debt, even a small move in yields translates to hundreds of billions in increased borrowing costs. Every basis point, That is 1/100% costs the government roughly $3 billion a year in additional interest every single basis point. Gold tells the same story from the other side. In 2025, gold surged over 40%, hitting $3,400 an ounce. Goldman Sachs projected it could approach 5,000. When gold runs that hard, it is not because people love shiny metal. It is because they're losing faith in paper. They're losing faith in the full faith and credit of the government that prints it. This is nail number 10, the squeeze. What the debt actually costs you here is where the forensic audit gets personal, because $38 trillion is an abstraction. Nobody can picture that number, but you can picture this. The government spent $970 billion in interest in fiscal year 2025. Divided by roughly 133 million U.S. households, that is about $7,300 per each household. Your household's share of the interest alone, not the debt, just the interest, was $7,300 last year. That is more than the average American household spends on healthcare, more than they spend on gasoline, clothing, or education. You paid that. Not directly, not as a line item on your tax return, but through higher interest rates on your mortgage, your car loan, your credit card, through the slow erosion of services that the government can no longer afford because the interest payment already ate the budget. This is what economists call crowd out. When the government borrows this much money, it competes with private borrowers for capital. That pushes interest rates higher for everyone. Your mortgage is more expensive because the Treasury is issuing trillions in bonds. Your small business loan costs more because there is less money left in the pool. The startup that would have hired you can't get funding because the government already drank the milkshake. The CBO estimates that the current debt trajectory will reduce average American income by 6% by 2055 compared to what it would be if debt were stable. 6% of your future income stolen by decisions already made. That is $49,000 less per person over the next 30 years. Think of it this way. If you are 30 years old today, the debt that has already been accumulated will cost you and every other 30-year-old in America a meaningful slice of your lifetime earnings. Not through a tax you can see, through a drag on the economy you can feel but can't name: slower growth, higher rates, fewer opportunities. The debt doesn't announce itself. It just makes everything a little harder, a little more expensive, a little more out of reach, and it does it every single day. And the options for fixing it, they range from painful to catastrophic. The CBO has laid out the math. To stabilize debt at current levels, Congress would need to immediately and permanently cut spending or raise taxes by the equivalent of about 2% of GDP. That is roughly $600 billion a year. Every year, starting now. That means either a 20% cut to non-interest spending or a major tax increase or some combination. And every year Congress waits, the required adjustment gets larger. Because the spiral keeps compounding, delay is the most expensive option, and delay is exactly what both parties have chosen. Every single time. Speaking of printing money, unfortunately, YouTube doesn't let me print cash. But if you hit that subscribe button, it tells the algorithm that this forensic analysis matters. It costs you nothing, and it helps more people understand what is actually happening to the balance sheet of the country they live in. Think of it as a civic duty, one that is cheaper than the $7,300 you already paid in interest this year. So where does this end? That is the question that keeps Treasury officials awake at night, even if they won't say it publicly, because the honest answer is that there are only a handful of outcomes, and none of them are painless. Outcome 1: Congress gets serious. They pass a comprehensive fiscal reform package that raises some taxes, cuts some spending, and gradually bends the debt curve downward. This is what happened in the 1990s when Clinton and a Republican Congress actually balanced the budget. It has happened before. It could happen again. But the political polarization today makes the 1990s look like a quilting bee. Nobody in Washington can agree on what day it is, let alone a multi-trillion-dollar fiscal adjustment. Outcome 2. The Federal Reserve monetizes the debt. Fancy way of saying they print money to buy Treasury bonds. This keeps interest rates artificially low and effectively lets the government borrow without limits. The problem: inflation. You are not reducing the debt. You are diluting the currency. Every dollar in your savings account buys a little less. Your groceries cost more. Your rent costs more. It is a stealth tax on everyone who holds dollars. And eventually, the bond market figures it out and demands even higher rates. Ask Venezuela how that worked out. Outcome 3. Financial repression. The government forces domestic institutions, banks, pension funds, insurance companies to hold treasury bonds through regulation. This keeps borrowing costs low by creating a captive audience of buyers. Britain did this after World War II when its debt-to-GDP ratio was 240%. It worked, but it took decades, and it meant an entire generation of savers earned returns below inflation. Their retirement funds quietly evaporated in real terms. It is a slow, silent wealth transfer from savers to the government. Outcome 4. Crisis. A real one, a moment where the bond market simply refuses to lend at reasonable rates, where a treasury auction fails, or nearly fails, where the Sell America trade becomes not a one-week event but a structural reality. The U.S. would face what is called a fiscal dominance scenario, where the debt dictates monetary policy, not the other way around. Interest rates spike, the dollar drops, borrowing costs explode, and the government is forced into emergency austerity, the kind that crushes economies overnight. History teaches us one undeniable lesson about sovereign debt crises. They don't happen gradually. They happen gradually, and then suddenly Greece was fine until it wasn't. The UK had a pension crisis in 2022 that materialized in 48 hours. Argentina has defaulted 9 times. Japan has a debt-to-GDP ratio of over 250% and has been stuck in stagnation for 3 decades. The math deteriorates slowly, but the market's reaction is always a step function. You are fine, and then you are not. And what makes the American situation uniquely dangerous is the scale. When Greece defaulted, it was a €300 billion problem. The European Union could bail it out. When the U.S. hits a wall, there is no one on earth with a checkbook big enough to bail out $38 trillion. America is too big to fail and too big to save. That is not a safety net. That is a trap. The verdict. So, here we are. The books are open. The audit is complete. Let's read the final bill. 1. The national debt has reached $38.4 trillion, over 100% of GDP, a level not seen since World War II. Interest payments hit $970 billion in 2025 and will cross $1 trillion this year, growing faster than any other budget category. 3. All 3 major credit agencies have downgraded the United States for the first time in over a century. 4. China has reduced its treasury holdings by over 40% while hoarding gold, and BRICS nations collectively hold over 6,000 tons. 5. Social Security's trust fund will be depleted by 2033, threatening automatic benefit cuts for 70 million Americans. 6. The One Big Beautiful Bill added $3.4 trillion more to the debt and was signed on Independence Day. The same month, Moody's downgraded the nation. 7. The CBO project's debt will reach 156% of GDP by 2055 if nothing changes. That is higher than Italy, higher than Greece at its peak, higher than any major economy has sustained without a restructuring or a currency crisis. 8. The bond market has already begun repricing American risk, with yields on the 30-year bond breaching 5%. 9. Every American household is now paying $7,300 a year just in interest on debt they never voted for. That is more than they spend on health care, gasoline, clothing, or education. And 10. Neither political party has presented a credible plan to fix it. Not one. The Democrats won't touch entitlement reform. The Republicans won't touch tax increases. And both parties keep passing legislation that makes the problem worse while claiming it makes it better. They are co-conspirators in a financial crime against the future. But let's be clear about what is really happening here. This isn't a crisis that is coming. This is a crisis that has already arrived and is simply waiting to be acknowledged. The United States isn't going bankrupt tomorrow. It still has the world's reserve currency, the world's largest military, the world's deepest capital markets, and an economy that still produces $27 trillion a year. These are extraordinary advantages that no other nation on earth possesses. But advantages are not immunity. Every empire that ever collapsed did so not because it ran out of power, but because it ran out of discipline. The Romans debased their currency. The British overextended their commitments. The Spanish squandered their colonial wealth. The Ottomans borrowed from European banks until the banks owned the empire. The pattern is always the same: strength breeds complacency. Complacency breeds excess. Excess breeds fragility, and fragility eventually breeds crisis. The United States has one advantage those empires didn't. It can see the numbers. The CBO publishes them every year. The trajectory is not a secret. The cliff is not hidden. It is right there, in black and white, in a PDF on a government website that anyone can read. The question is not whether the cliff exists. The question is whether anyone in power has the courage to steer away from it. So far, the answer has been no for 40 years. Through 12 Congresses and 6 presidents. The $38 trillion question isn't whether the math is broken. The math has been broken for years. The question is whether the political system is capable of fixing it before the bond market forces the issue. Because if politicians won't impose discipline, the market will. And the market is not kind. The market doesn't negotiate. The market doesn't care about your ideology. The market looks at the numbers, and the numbers either add up or they don't. There will be debates. There will be commissions. There will be blue ribbon panels and bipartisan frameworks and 12-step plans that never make it past step 1. But there is no commission big enough to paper over the mathematics of compound interest. You cannot legislate away arithmetic. You cannot tweet away a $1 trillion interest bill. You cannot blame the other party for a debt that both parties built, brick by brick, bill by bill, for 40 years. The $38 trillion bomb is ticking. The fuse was lit decades ago by politicians who knew exactly what they were doing and who calculated correctly that they would be out of office before the bill came due. Well, the bill is here. It is on the kitchen table, and it is addressed to you, your children, and their children after that. You didn't sign it. You didn't vote for most of it, but you are paying for it. $7,300 a year and counting. The greatest nation in human history is not being defeated by an enemy. It is being defeated by a spreadsheet, by compound interest, by the simple, brutal, apolitical math of borrowing more than you earn, year after year, decade after decade, until the interest on the interest on the interest becomes the largest line item in the budget. That is not a political opinion. That is arithmetic. And arithmetic doesn't care who you voted for. If you found this forensic deep dive valuable, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Share this with someone who still thinks the national debt is an abstraction. It is not abstract. It is $7,300 a year from your household. It is the bridge that didn't get built. It is the school that didn't get funded. It is the social security check that is about to get cut. And hit subscribe if you want to be here when we audit what comes next. Because whether it is the bond market that forces the reckoning or a political leader brave enough to tell the truth, the next chapter of this story is going to reshape the global financial order. I'll see you in the comments, and remember, economics isn't just about money. It is about the promises we make to each other. And right now, the United States is writing checks that the future can't cash.